Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back to another video. Today I'll be showing you how to build a complex table in React. This table is going to have a lot of cool features like column resizing and custom cell inputs like this editable text field, a custom status menu, and a date picker. I'm also going to add pagination so we can efficiently render large amounts of data. We'll be able to sort by task and date, and we'll also be able to filter by task name or the status. I'll be using a library called TanStack Table to build the table, and then Chakra UI to style the components. Without further ado, let's get started. I have the starter files open here, and they're going to be linked in the description below if you guys want to follow along. Just make sure to run npm install and then npm run dev to start the server. Right now, we just have this heading and an empty task table. And our entire app is wrapped by this Chakra provider with our theme injected in. Our theme just has some basic config and global styles. And these are the styles that will be used to style our table and the components within it. I'm not really going to go over these too much because that's not the focus of the video, but you can always refer back to this file if you want to know how the table's styled. So let's start building our task table. As I mentioned, we're going to be using the TanStack Table library. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a headless UI library for creating tables. All that means is that it doesn't provide any pre-built components or any styling, but it does give us a ton of helper functions to create, manage, and interact with our table. But it's our job to create the UI that displays the table and interacts with it. So the way we create a table is by calling a hook. The name of that hook is called useReactTable. And that comes from the TanStack Table library. And that's going to return a table instance, so we'll just capture that in a variable called table. And this table is going to contain all of the helper functions that come from the library. So we can see all these different methods that we can use to interact with the table. We'll just store it in a variable called table for now. As a parameter, we need to pass it a few properties. The first is a data property, and this will be the data that is going to be displayed in our table. I have a file here that contains all the data for our table, and it's just an array with a bunch of objects. And each object is going to represent a row, which will have 4 different properties. And these properties are going to be our columns. So let's go ahead and import this data array in our table. And we're going to want to store that data in state. So let's call the useState hook. We'll call the piece of state data. And the initial value is going to be that data array that we just saw. We're just going to import this real quick. Now that we have the data being passed into the table, we need to add another property called columns. And columns will be an array of column definitions. So let's go ahead and create that array. Each column definition is just an object that configures the column. If we look at the docs, we could see that the column definition takes an accessor key, and an accessor key is basically just the key on the row object that's used to extract the value for that column. So if we look at our data, and this object is a row. If we need to access the task, then the key will be task. If we want the status, then the accessor key will be status. So let's go ahead and add the accessor key. And for the first column, it was task. And now the next property I want to add is the header. If we go back to the docs, we could see that the header takes either a string or a function that returns a React component. And this header property really just refers to the header for each column. In our case, we could just use a string because we don't need anything complicated for this header. So let's go back and add our header value, and we could just call that task. And then the next property we need is the cell. And the cell is going to refer to each individual cell for the row. For the cell, we're going to need to pass a custom React component for each column. If we go back to the docs, we could see that the cell takes a function, and as a parameter, it gets this props object. And within our component, we can have access to the table, the row, the column, and a few helper functions. So let's go back and add our cell. And the most basic cell we could add is just a function that returns some JSX. So we'll just return a paragraph, and inside, we want to call the getValue function. So we'll take in the props here, and we could call the getValue function that we just saw in the docs. So we'll do props.getValue. And this will just render the value as it is on the row object. Now let's create the rest of the columns. So I'm just going to copy and paste this. And since we have 4 properties here, we need 4 column definitions. And I'm just going to split this as we create the rest. Now the next property is called status. So I'll change the accessor key to status and the header to just status. And for now, we'll keep the cell like this. And then we need to change the due date. And lastly, the notes. Now that we've created all the column definitions, let's go ahead and add the next property. And that's called getCoreRowModel. The value will be getCoreRowModel invoked. And this is a method that comes from the TanStack library, so make sure you import it. This would just basically allow the row model to work under the hood within the ReactTable library. And these are all the props that we need to get started. So let's go ahead and create our table container. It'll be a box with a class name of table. And now we want to render out the headers for the table. The way that we can get access to that is by calling the getHeaderGroups on the table. So we'll just log table.getHeaderGroups. And let's just see what that looks like. We could see that it's an array of header groups. In our case, we just have one header group, and that has a property called headers. And each header item here has a column property. Within that column property, it has the ColumnDef property. And this refers to the column definitions we set up right here. And the value that we're interested in is this header property. So it's pretty nested deep, but our goal is to map through each header in this array and output that deeply nested header property. So let's go back in our code and output the headers. Let's start by calling table.getHeaderGroups. And then we're going to map through the header groups. And for each header group, we want to return another box. And we want to give that a class name of TableRow, or TR. And we'll give it a key of headerGroup.id. Now inside each header group, we want to map through the headers array. So we'll do headerGroup.headers.map. And for each header, we want to output another box. And we'll give that a class name of th. And we'll also give it a key of header.id. And here's where we're going to output that string. So we can call header.column.columnDef.header. And this will actually render out this header that we defined. So if we hit save, we should be able to see those headers on the table. And there they are. Now let's output the rows. To do that, we need to call table.getRowModel. And then we need to access the rows property. And we're going to map through each row. And for each row, we're going to return a box once again. We'll give the box a class name of tr and a key of row.id. And now within each row, we need to render out the cells. So we'll call row.getVisibleCells. And then we're going to map through each cell and output a box. We'll give the box a class name of td and a key of cell.id. And now instead of doing something like this to render out the cell value, we have to actually call another function called flexRender. And the reason for that is if we look back at the column definition and the header property, you could see that it's just a string. So for the header, it's all just strings, and we could render that out. But for the cell property, it's not a string, it's actually a React component. And the way that we render React components and enable them to get these props injected in is to call the flexRender method. That's a function that comes from the TanStack library, and we could just import it at the top, and we could see the first parameter is the component, and the second parameter is the props. So in order to get access to the component, we need to write cell.column.columnDef and then .cell. And all we're really doing is getting the column definition, which is one of these, and then accessing the cell property, which would be this React component. The second parameter is the props, and the way that we can inject the props is to call cell.getContext. And now if we save this, we should see all of our rows displayed. And we're getting an error. And the reason for that is because in our status definition for the cell property, we're outputting props.getValue. If we look at the status, the value is actually this object, and we can't just output an object to the screen. Instead, we should output the name. So let's go back and do props.getValue, and we'll just add .name. And sometimes there isn't a status, like here, so we'll just add a question mark here to only access the name if it exists. Now we have to do the same thing for the date, because the due date is an actual date object, and we can't render that out to the screen. So we'll just check if the value exists and call toLocale_timestring. Now if we save, we should see those errors go away. The errors are gone, but our table still looks terrible. That's because I forgot to add the width to our components. So we want to add the width property, and we'll make it equal to table.getTotalSize. And for the th, we also want to set the width property equal to header.getSize. And lastly, for the td, we want to also set the width to cell.column.getSize. And now our table should look normal. If I wanted to change the size of each column, I could go back to the column definitions and add a size property. I'll set it to 50 pixels. And if we hit save, you'll see that the column shrank to 50 pixels. Now, ideally, we'd want to set a default size and then allow the user to resize the column dynamically. If we look at the finished product, we'll see that the user can resize the column to be whatever width they want. So let's start working on that feature. The way that this will work is we need to create this resizer bar. And this is just going to be a div that's absolutely positioned on this header cell. And by default, it will have its opacity set to 0. But once you hover over the header cell, the opacity will be set to 1. So let's go ahead and create this resizer div. Right after we display the header value, we'll create the div. So we need to give it a class name of resizer. If we hit save, we should be able to see that resizer bar, and there it is. If we open up the styles file, we can see that this resizer class has a few CSS properties. It's positioned absolutely and has an opacity of 0. And this CSS selector is basically saying that any element that's hovered and has a child with the class name of resizer, it'll set the resizer opacity to 1. And that's how it's displaying. We also have this selector, which checks if the resizer also has the isResizing class. If that's the case, it'll change the background color of the resizer div to green and also set the opacity to 1. Now this class will be set on the resizer anytime the column is resized. And that's all handled by the TanStack Table library, so we just need to add the necessary props to make it all work. Let's go back to the resizer component, and instead of having this be a string, let's make it a template literal. We'll add the resizer class, and now we have to check if the column is being resized, and if it is, we need to add that isResizing class right here. So we can check if the column is being resized by a helpful utility function from the TanStack library, and it's called header.column.getIsResizing. And this is going to return a Boolean, and we want to check if that's true. We want to output that class name, isResizing. Otherwise, just output an empty string. So now, only when the column is being resized, it's going to add this class name and change the color to green. Now we need to add 2 more props to it. The first is onMouseDown, and this is going to be equal to another utility function from TanStack library, and it's going to be header.getResizeHandler. And this will just return a function that will handle all the resizing. And we also want to add onTouchStart. That's going to be equal to header.getResizeHandler as well. Now the last thing we need to do is go back up to our table configuration and add the column resize mode. And that's going to be a string of onChange. And that's basically going to resize the column as we change it and drag it around, as opposed to when we let go of the mouse. So if we hit save and go back here, it should all work properly. And if we were to change this to onEnd, you could see how that works. And that just basically resizes the column and you drop the cursor. We'll change this back. And now we could start working on this first text input. Let's begin by first increasing the size of the task input to something like 225. And instead of returning this paragraph for the cell, let's create our own custom component that will have the editable input and will update the table state. So under components, let's create a new file and call it editable cell. And let's start building out this component. The way that this is going to work is each task cell is going to be an input with its own local state. Once you type in the state and you blur it, it will then update the overall table state. Let's first begin by creating this input with its local state. In this return value, we want to return an input, and that's going to come from Chakra, and then I'm going to paste in some styles. And now we need to hook up this input to some local state. Let's call the useState hook. And we'll store the state in a variable called value. And the default value will just be an empty string. Now let's hook up our input to this state. So we'll set the value equal to our state value. And the onChange function will take in the event and call setValue, passing in the event.target.value. Let's make sure to import the useState hook and also make sure the input is self-closing. Now if we save, we should be able to use this editable cell in our column definition. Let's get rid of this function and paste in the editable cell, import that. And if we hit save, now we see this input and we could type in the local state and it works. Now we need to initialize the input with whatever the value is for the row, because right now, initially, all the inputs are empty. So we can do that by using one of the helpful utility functions from TanStack. If you remember from the docs, this cell gets passed all these properties, and the method that we're interested in is getValue. So we can go ahead and destructure getValue, and we can capture the return value of that. So we'll say initial value is equal to getValue invoked, and then we'll pass in the initial value to our state. So now if we hit save, all of the inputs should be initialized with the value. The next thing we want to do is ensure that our local state here is in sync with the outer table state. So let's call the useEffect hook, and we're going to pass in a function which is only going to run when the initial value changes. And what it's going to do is update our local state. So we'll call setValue, and we'll set it to whatever the initial value is. The last thing we need to do is update our overall table state once we blur the input. Because right now, all of this state is only being changed locally. And you can see that by going back to the table and logging the data. If we go back and open up the console, you'll see here's all the data. And if we update this add new feature task, you'll see that it never actually gets updated here. So we need a way to update this data for the table through our editable cell. The way that we're going to do that is add a meta property on the table configuration. This meta property is going to contain metadata on the table that will be accessible through our custom cells. So we need to create a function that will update this data. We'll call the function updateData, and we're going to need to pass in 3 params. If we look back at our data state, it's an array of rows. So we first need to know which row we need to update, the index of the row. Once we have that, we need to know which column to update. In our case, that's task. And then we also need the new value to update it to. So let's take in those 3 values. We'll get the row index, the column ID, and the value. Then we're going to call setData. We'll get the previous data as a property, and we want to return a new array with the updated data. So we'll call previous.map, and we're going to map through each row and the index of that row. And then we want to check if the current index that we're mapping through is equal to the row index that was passed in, which means this is the row that we need to update. So if that's true, we're going to update it. Otherwise, we're just going to return the row. Now we need to spread the previous properties of the row. So we'll do previous of the row index. And now we need to set the new value. And this column ID will be the property that we need to set. So we can open up square brackets and add the column ID. And we want to set it to the value that was passed in. So again, to reiterate, we're mapping through the previous data and we're checking for the current row in the loop. And if that current row is equal to the row index that's passed in from our cell, then we want to set it to this object, which will spread the old values and override the new value. Otherwise, we'll just return the old row. Now that we have this function, we need to call it from inside our editable cell. In the props, we get access to the row itself, the column, and also the table. Now let's create our blur function that's going to call this update data meta function. So we'll say const on blur is equal to a function. And we're going to call the table.options.meta to get access to that meta property. We'll check if it exists, and if it does, we'll call update data. So now this function will be what we defined here. And so we need to pass in these three parameters. We have access to those through the props. To pass the row index, we could do row.index. For the column ID, we could do column.id. And for the value, we just want to send the value in our state. Now let's use this onBlur function in our input. And this should update the table state. So if we add a few exclamation points, we'll see in our state, it gets updated there. So now our table is in sync with each local input. So that wraps it up for the editable input. Let's start working on the status input. We'll start by creating a new file under components. We'll call it status cell. And in the props, we're going to want to destructure these same properties. And instead of this div, we're going to want to return a Chakra menu. So if we open up their docs and go to the first basic example, we just want to copy all of that and paste it in, and then import all these components. Now for the menu, we want to add a few props. We'll add isLazy. And that will just prevent all these items from rendering unless the menu is open. We also want to set the offset, and that'll just position the menu. We want to set flip to false and auto select to false. For the menu button, I'm going to get rid of these props and just paste some new ones in. Instead of actions, I'll just change this to status for now. And let's just confirm that this menu is working. So we'll go back to our column definition and get rid of this function, paste in our status cell, and we should see that new menu. And there it is, it's working. Now let's replace this status with the actual status of that row. We can get the status of the current row by calling getValue, and that's going to return the object in our data. So something like this. So let's destructure the properties. We'll grab the name and the color. And sometimes the status is null, so we'll just default it to an empty object. Now, instead of status, let's just output the name here. And for the background color of this button, I want it to be the color of the status. So we'll set the BG equal to the color. And if it doesn't have a color, we'll default it to transparent. And lastly, I'll set the text color to gray.900. Now we should see that status. And it looks like they're showing up correctly. Now let's work on these menu options. Instead of using these values, we want to loop through our own custom statuses that we've defined. If you open up the data file, you'll see that we have an array of all the statuses that we want in our app. So let's just go ahead and copy that over and make sure to import it. We're going to map through each status, and then we want to return a menu item. For the value, we'll just output status.name. And then we want to add some props to the item. First, we'll give it the onClick handler, and we want that to be the function that updates our table state. So first we need to grab that update data method that we defined in the meta. So let's come up here and just do const update data. And we're going to get that from the table.options.meta. Now let's go ahead and use that down here. So we'll set this equal to a function that's going to call update data. And then we'll pass in the same 3 params as before. So row.index, column.id, and the value we want to set it to is the current status that we're looping through. So this will be an object that has the ID, name, and color. And then we also want to add a key to the item. So we'll set that to status.id. And then let's remove these old items. And now we should see the menu with our own custom statuses. The last thing we have to add is the little color icon. So let's go ahead and create that icon above. We'll do const color icon is equal to a function. That's going to take a color prop, and then we'll grab the rest of the props if any were passed. And we're just going to return a div. Then we want to add some properties to it to style it. I'm just going to paste those in real quick. So we're just giving it a width and height, setting the background color, and giving a border radius. Now let's go ahead and use that in front of our name. And we want to pass it a color prop, and that's going to be equal to the current status.color. So now if we save, we should see that. And there we go. Now let's just add some margin right. And those should be good. And now if we change it, it should actually update our table. There we go. And the last thing I want to do is add an option to clear the status. So we'll just take one of these menu items and add it above. And for the name, we'll just do none. And for the color, we'll just do red.400. It doesn't need a key, and for the update data function, instead of passing in a status, we'll just set it to null. So now we should be able to clear a status. And there we go. Now let's start working on this date picker. Let's begin by creating a new file. We'll call it datecell. We're going to be using a npm package to build our date picker, and it's called React Date Picker. So if we just scroll down to the example, we need to copy these imports. And we're going to need to destructure the same props as the other components. So I'm going to just copy these over. And we're also going to need these 2 lines. So we'll copy those over as well. Now, instead of returning this div, we want to return the React date picker that we imported at the top. And this date picker takes some props. The first one we want to pass is the wrapper class name, and I'll call that date wrapper. And there are some styles that are going to apply. And then we also want to pass the date format. We'll give it 3 M's and a D. Next, we want to pass the selected prop, and this is going to refer to the date that's selected. In our case, we want to set that to the date that is on our row, so this do property. And since we're getting that value up here, we can just set that to date, and then we could pass that in down here. And let's remove this default value of an object. If there's no date, it's fine to just leave it as null. The next property we want to add is the onChange function. And this is going to run anytime the user selects a date. So we'll pass a function and we get the date that they selected as a parameter. And then we want to call the update data function. We'll pass in the same parameters as before. So row.index, column.id, and for the value, we'll just pass the date that they selected. So now let's use this in our column definition. We'll remove this function and pass in our date cell. So now we should be able to see that input here. And when we change a date, it should be reflected in that cell. Now let's start styling this input. We can tell the date picker to use a custom component to render our date. We just have to pass the custom input prop. And this will take a React component as a value. So let's go ahead and create that component above. We'll call it date custom input. And we want to destructure some props. So we want to grab the value and the onClick function. And this is going to come from the date picker library. And then we want to return some JSX. We'll return a center. And this will refer to our cell. Whenever the cell is clicked, we want to run the onClick function. And that will take care of opening up the date picker. We also want to pass it some style props, so we'll set the cursor to pointer. For the children, we want to check if a value exists. So if there's a current date, then we want to output a fragment. Otherwise, we want to return the calendar icon. If we look at the finished example, you'll see that if there's a date, it renders it out. Otherwise, it has this calendar icon. So let's go and add that calendar icon. And then we'll set the font size to XL. Now, if there's a value, we're just going to output that value. Now let's go ahead and pass this to the custom input. And in order for this to render properly, we need to wrap the component in the forward ref function. And that comes from React. And we'll just wrap the entire component. The first parameter will be the properties that we want to pass. And then the second one is the ref. And we're just going to set the ref on that center component. Now if we save, we should see our custom input. And there it is. The last thing we need to do is add the little X icon to clear the date. So if there's a value, we want to output that value, but then we also want to add that little icon. So right after the value that we output, let's add a box. For the child, we want to output the times symbol. And then I'm going to paste in some style props. The next thing we need to do is clear the date when a user clicks on this box. So let's create the onClick function. The way that this will work is we need to pass a function to the custom input that will clear the date when you click on it. So let's define that function, and we could call it clearDate. And let's pass a function that's going to call updateData. And we'll pass in the same three params as before: row.index, column.id. And since we're clearing the date, we want to pass null. Now we could take this clearDate function and destructure it in our props. Then we could call it down here in our onClick handler. So if we hit save and go back to our app, we should see that X. But you see when we click the X, it actually opens up the date picker. And in order to fix that, let's take in the event and then call event.stopPropagation. And this will prevent the event from going on to its parent, which is this center div, which calls this onClick function. So by stopping the event, it never reaches this click handler. So now when we click it, it should work as expected. That wraps it up for the date picker. And I just realized that we forgot to update this notes column. So let's go ahead and paste in that editable cell from the task input. Now that should look normal. Now let's begin by creating these filters. But first, let's look at the docs to see how we can implement this. So all we need to do is create a filter state that we pass to our table. And then our table knows to only show the rows that match that filter. If we look at the filter state, it has a column filters property, and that's equal to an array of column filter objects. Each column filter object is going to have an ID and a value. This will refer to the column ID, and the value will be the value that we want to use to filter by. In our case, that's whatever the user input in the text box. So let's go ahead and create our filter state. Right below our data state, let's add our column filter state, and we'll call it column filters. That's going to be equal to useState, and the default state will be an empty array, which means there's no filters. And to pass this state to our table, we need to add a property called state. And anything we define inside this state object will be accessible through the table utility functions like table.getState. So we can call that function through other components. Now that we're passing that to the table, we need to create the filter components that actually have the input. So under components, let's create a file called filters. And we'll swap out this div for a box. Let's create an input group. And we're going to pass some style props to it. We'll set the size to small and give it a max width of 12 rem. Then inside, we want to add an input left element. And we'll set the pointer events to none. And this is going to be an icon. And we want to use the search icon. And then below that, let's add our actual input. I'm going to paste in some styles real quick. Now let's import our filters on our table. We'll add it right above the table. And we should see it now right above there. Let's add some bottom margin first. We also need to add a new property called getFilteredRowModel. And that's going to be equal to getFilteredRowModel invoked. And that's a function that comes from the TanStack library. And this will just make all the magic behind filtering work. Now we need to hook up this input to our table filter state. To show you how this is going to work, I'm just going to create a filter object. We'll set the ID to task because that's the column we want to filter by. And for the value, we're just going to pass in a string to filter by. So now if we look at our tasks, they're filtered by this add. So what we need to do is when a user types in this input, we need to create an object with the ID of task and the value to be whatever they typed in. So we could delete this for now, and let's pass in these properties to our filter component. Now we could go and destructure that. Now let's grab the filter value that comes from our column filters state. So we'll do const task name is equal to column filters dot find. Now in here, we want to look for a filter object that has the ID of task because that's the column that we want to filter by. So for every filter, let's check if the filter.id is equal to task. And if it finds an object with that ID of task, we want to grab the value property on it. Otherwise, we'll default it to an empty string. Now let's pass this task name in for the input value. Next, we need to add the onChange function. So whenever the user types in the input, we need to call the setColumnFilters function to add that object to our column filters array. So let's create a function up here. We'll call it onFilterChange. And this will be a function that takes in the ID, which is the column ID, and the value. And this function is going to call setColumnFilters. Now we want to remove any previous task filters and concatenate a new filter object with the current state of the input. We can do that by getting the previous state and returning a new array. We want to remove any objects that have the ID that matches the filter. So in our case, that's task. So we'll do previous.filter. For each object, we only want to return the filters that don't have the ID of task. And then once those are filtered out, we want to call the concat method and add a new object with the ID that was passed in and the value that was also passed in. So these properties here. Now we can call this onFilterChange function down here. So we'll grab the event and then call onFilterChange. We'll pass in task as the column ID, and for the value, we'll get the event.target.value. Now if we save and log our column filter state, we should see that new object being set. And here it is. We'll see that our column filter array has an object and the ID is task and the value is the value of the input. And now our table is actually being filtered. Now let's work on adding this status filter. Under components, let's create a new file called FilterPopover. For this component, we want to return a Chakra popover. So if we go to their docs and scroll down to the first basic example, this is what we'll use as a starter. So we'll copy that and paste it in here, and then import all these components. We can remove the header. We'll want to add the isLazy prop to the popover. For the button, we'll give it a size of small, and a left icon of the filter icon. And we'll set the font size to 18. Then instead of trigger, we'll just call it filter. Then we can remove this body and paste in some text inputs. So we'll have filter by and then the status. And right below the status, we want to loop through each status in our array and output a div. First, we'll create a vertical stack to space them properly. We'll set the align to flex start, and we'll give a spacing of 1. And in here, we want to map through each status and return a status item. And we're going to create this component in a second. But we're going to pass the status in the props and also give it a key. We'll set that to status.id. Now let's create the box that renders each status. So const status item, we're going to destructure the status in the props. And we're going to return a flex component, which is just a flex box. I'm going to paste in some styles real quick. And for the children, we want to output the status.name. And we also want to grab that color icon from the status cell. We want to export this color icon, and I'll just grab the same one here, paste that in and import it at the top. And now we can import this filter popover in our filters component. We'll put it right below the input group. And we should see that filter popover. And there it is. And in order for this to display horizontally, we need to change this from a box to be a horizontal stack. And we'll give it some spacing. And these should be aligned properly. Now let's start adding the filter functionality. So when a user clicks on a status icon, we should create a column filter object, and the value will be an array of the status ID that was clicked. And if a user clicks another status, that status ID will be added to that value array. So let's go back to our filter popover, and on the status item, let's add an onClick handler. This is going to be a function. And when it's clicked, we want to update the table column filter state. So let's hop into our filters and pass these properties into our popover. Now we could destructure them here. Then we could pass set column filters to each status item. Now in the status item, we could destructure that function and call it in here. For now, let's just pass an array with one status filter. We'll set the ID to status, and the value is going to be an array of 1. And we'll just hard code this for now. If we go back to our table and we click on a status, you'll see our filters array now has the status filter object, and the value is an array of a status ID. Now we need to refactor this to pass the actual status ID and then also handle multiple statuses. And let's remove this for now. We also don't need these curly braces. And now in the set column filters, we're going to get the previous filters. And we want to check if there are any active status filters. So we could do const statuses equals previous.find. So we're going to look through the array of filters, and for each filter, we're going to check if the filter.id is equal to status. And if we find one, we want to grab the value property. And remember, this is going to be an array of status IDs. And we'll do a quick check. If there are no statuses, then we're going to return the previous filters and concatenate a new filter object. We'll set the ID to status, and the value will just be an array with the first status filter. And we need to pass the ID, so we'll do status.id. So now, if there are no statuses, we're just going to return all the filters with this new object added on, which will have the status ID of the one that was clicked. So now, if we hit save and we have one filter here, we'll see that in the state, but then we also click a status, we'll see that we have two filter objects. One is for the task and one is for the status. And in our status, our value looks correct. Now let's work on adding multiple statuses. So if we make it past this if check, that means that there was already a status filter that was active. So now we want to return the previous filters, and we're going to map through each one. And for each filter, we're going to check if the filter.id is equal to status. If this is the case, then this is the filter object that we want to update. Otherwise, we'll just return the filter. Now in this object that we want to update, we first want to spread the old filter. And for the value, we need to either add a new ID to the array or remove it if it was already active. So we need to do something like isActive. And if that's true, then we want to filter out the status. But if the filter is not active and it was clicked, then we want to concatenate the status ID. First, let's filter out the status if it is active. So we'll do statuses.filter. And we only want to keep the status IDs that don't match the one that was clicked. So we'll do status does not equal status.id. And this would be the ID of the status that was clicked. If the status was not active, then we want to add it to the array. So we'll do statuses.concat. And we'll just pass in status ID. So now, if the status was previously active, it'll be removed from the array. Otherwise, it'll be added to the array. Now let's work on the logic for this isActive flag. The way that we can figure out if any status is active is to first grab the array of all the active statuses. We'll do const filter statuses, and that's going to be equal to columnFilters.find, and we want to find the filter that has an ID of status. If that's found, we want to get the value property, which will be the array of status IDs, and if that's not found, we'll default it to an empty array. So now we can use this to see if the current status item that we're mapping through is included in this array, and if it is, then it means that it's active. So we'll add the prop isActive, and that's going to be equal to filterStatuses.includes, and then we'll pass in the status.id. We just need to destructure this isActive flag, and it should work properly. Let's go back to our table and select a status. We'll see that the ID is in the array, and if we click it again, it should get removed. And now our array is empty. And let's check that we could add multiple statuses. So I just added 2, and we should see 2 different IDs. And there we go. Now let's work on displaying the status in an active state if it's selected. In the status item, let's add a BG property, and let's check if it's active. We'll give it a background color of gray.800, otherwise it'll be transparent. Now we'll see that they're displayed in an active state, and if we remove it, it goes away. Now let's work on actually filtering the rows by status. To do that, we have to update our column definitions. So let's find the status definition, and we need to add a few new properties. The first one is enable column filter. We're going to set that to true. The second property is a filter function. And this can either be a string or a function that returns a Boolean, which will tell the table whether to render the row or not. So if we look at the docs, the values for the filter function can either be a string, which will use one of the built-in functions from TanStack. So for example, we could set it to include string, and that will only filter out rows by this condition. Or we could pass it a function, and that function will get a number of properties. It will get the row, the column ID, and the filter value. So we can use these properties to determine whether the row should be rendered or not. Let's go back to our definitions. And if we wanted to be explicit, we should add this to our task cell. This worked before without these properties because there are some defaults that the library used to filter by, but we should set these properties. So we'll use the built-in function called includeString. And for our status filter, we want to add a custom function. And this function is going to take a few parameters. So we're going to get the row, the column ID, and the filter value. And we'll just call it filter statuses because that's a bit more specific. Now this function needs to return a Boolean. If it returns true, then the row will be kept. If it returns false, then it'll be removed. First, let's grab the status of the current row that's being evaluated. So we'll do const status equals row.getValue. And remember, in our data, this object is a row. So when we call getValue, we need to pass in a column ID. In our case, we want status. So we'll pass in column ID. And since we're in the status column, this will be that string. Now status will be either the status object or null if it doesn't have a status. And we want to return filter statuses. And remember, this is going to be the array of status IDs that are defined in our status filter right here. So we want to check that array and see if it includes the status ID being evaluated. And this status could be null, so we'll just add a question mark. And now if we save, the filter should work. So we'll select on deck, and only that status is displayed, and then we'll add in progress, and that works. And if we add a third filter, that should also work. However, if we start removing these filters, you'll see that when we have no filters, the table doesn't display any rows. And the reason for that is our filter value is an empty array. So our filter function, when it does this check, the status being evaluated will never be true because it's never going to be in an empty array. So we just need to add a little check at the top. We'll do if filter statuses dot length is 0, meaning there are no active statuses, then we'll return true, meaning we should keep the row in the data. So now if we go ahead and refresh, add a filter, and then remove it, the table goes back to normal. That wraps up the filtering. Now let's work on the sorting functionality. To begin, we need to add a new property to our React table. And that's called getSortedRowModel. And again, in order for sorting to work, we need to invoke this function, which comes from the TanStack library. Now we can add our sort icon in our table header. So let's find our th, and right below the header that we output, let's open up curly braces, and we can use a helpful utility function to check if the column can be sorted. So we'll do header.column.getCanSort. And this function is going to return a Boolean. So if this is true, we'll add the double ampersand, and we want to output an icon. Only if the column is sortable, we'll output this icon, and we want to use the sort icon. We'll give it some margin. Font size will be 14. And lastly, we want to add an onClick handler. For the onClick handler, we can use another helpful utility function. We'll call header.column.getToggleSortingHandler. And this function is going to return another function that will handle all the logic behind the scenes to get sorting to work. So now if we save, we should be able to sort by the columns. And that seems to be working. By default, all the columns are sortable unless we explicitly disable that feature in the column definition. So for the status, it doesn't have a great default sort. So let's go ahead and disable that. We go up to the status column definition. We can add another property called enable sorting, and we'll set that to false. And now that icon won't be displayed because this helper utility function, getCanSort, will return false for that column. The next thing I want to do is add a little indicator icon, which will tell the user whether the sort is ascending or descending. We can do that using another utility function from TanStack. So let's just call header.column.getIsSorted. And let's just see what this returns. You'll see that it's either ascending or descending, and if there's no sort, then it's just empty. So let's output that icon. So we can create an object and add those two cases. Ascending, if it is ascending, we're going to return this icon, and if it's descending, we'll return this icon. And off of this object, we want to access it, so we'll open up the square brackets, and then we'll just paste in this utility function in the square brackets. This function will either return ascending or descending, and therefore it'll grab the string value and output it. If it doesn't find these properties, then it'll output undefined. If we save this now, we should see that indicator. That wraps up sorting. If you guys wanted to sort by the status, you'll have to pass a custom sorting function in the column definition, similar to how we add a custom filter function, but I won't be going over that in this video. The last thing we need to add is pagination. Let's begin by adding these inputs. In order to get pagination working, we need to update our table configuration. Let's pass a new prop called getPaginationRowModel. And again, we have to invoke that from the TanStack library. And now we'll be able to use the pagination utility functions. Right after this box here, which is the end of our table component, let's create a text input. Now we're going to use two utility functions. The first one is table.getState. And then we want to access the PaginationState and get the page index, and we'll see what that returns. And the second function is table.getPageCount. So if we just look at what this returns, you'll see 0 and 1. 0 is the index of the page, and we want to just add 1 to it to get the actual page number. And then this one is the total pages. By default, the pagination state renders 10 rows, and since we have less than 10, there's only one page. So we'll add a few more rows to test the pagination. Let's make this a bit more human readable. So we'll say page, and then this value that we want to add of with a space. And then let's add one to the page index. So now that should be a little bit more human readable. Let's also add a break above this text just to add some spacing. And then in our data, I'm going to add a few more tasks so we can test the pagination. So if I save this, then we'll see page 1 out of 3. Now let's add these buttons to navigate between the pages. Let's go below our text input and output a button group. In here, we'll want to add two buttons, one for the previous page and one for the next page. Now let's add the on-click handlers for the buttons. Let's pass a function, and we want to call table.previouspage. We also want to add an isDisabled prop. We want to check if the table has a previous page, so we could do table.getCanPreviousPage. That's also a function, and we just want to check if it's false. So if it can't get the previous page, then this button will be disabled. Now let's do the same thing for the next page button. This time we want to call table.nextPage. And we'll just copy this isDisabled prop and change this to getCanNextPage. So now our pagination should be working. And there we go. If you guys want to customize the pagination behavior, like only output 3 rows instead of 10, you'll have to add PaginationState to the table. For example, you'll add a new property here called Pagination. And if you look at the docs on pagination, you'll see that this pagination state takes two properties, the page index and the page size. The page size will refer to how many rows it displays per page, and the page index is which page you're currently viewing. So if we add the page size and set it to 3, and set the page index to 0, you'll see that now it only displays 3 rows. With this method, however, we have to manage updating the state because these buttons no longer work using the built-in utility functions. We would have to store this pagination in some state above here and pass that in like we're doing with the column filters. So that's a bit more work, but I just wanted to show you guys how to do that if you were interested in that. That wraps it up for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you haven't already. It would help me out a ton. Let me know in the comments if you have any feedback or what you guys want to see next, and I'll see you in the next one.